everyone, so today I will show you guys how you can perform API calls in Java, and I'll do that by showing you an example on how I retrieve this weather data through an API call. So in this video I'll go over the files you'll need, demonstrate how to do an API call in Java, and teach you how to read the JSON object that is returned after performing an API call. This code will also be available on my GitHub, which I'll leave a link down in the description. By the end of this video, you will have a better understanding on how to perform API calls in Java. Without further ado, let's begin. So first, you'll want to go to this link here where we will download the jar file that we'll use to read the JSON data. Select the first option that you see, which is going to be the JSON simple 1.1.1.jar file. So you'll want to store this file somewhere you'll remember. And for me, what I like to do sometimes is I create a folder called Java libraries where I put all of my jar files that I've used in the past in there so I could just easily retrieve it and then put it to whichever project I want. Once the file is done, let's head over to our code editor. So here what we want to do is add the jar file into our project structure so that we can utilize the classes that are stored into the jar file. First, we're going to create a folder named lib, and this is the folder that we're going to store the JSON jar file that we downloaded in. So locate your jar file, then right click and hit copy, then go to the lib folder and then right click and then paste the jar file in there and select OK. After that, we're going to add it to our project structure, and to do that we select file at the top left and then select the project structure option. A dialog should appear, and then we're going to select the modules category, and then next we select the plus button and then select the jar option, then locate the jar file in our lib folder and select it, and then hit OK, and then hit apply and then OK again. So we've successfully integrated the JSON jar file into our project structure. Now we can utilize its classes to read JSON data, which is useful when we're going to read the JSON data that's being returned through our API calls. So in this example, we're going to be using two APIs. So one of the APIs will be getting the latitude and longitude values from a given city, and the other API will use that latitude and longitude data to get the weather data from that given location. For the simplicity of this example, I won't go over too much on the APIs that are being used here. I'll be selecting a few settings that you can follow along, but feel free to test and mess around a bit. Also, I'll be leaving the links to the APIs used in this video down in the description. First up is the Geolocation API, and with this API, we are able to retrieve the latitude and longitude data by providing a city. For example, if we search Tokyo, we can preview the data here. Now it shows multiple results, but for simplicity, I'm just going to limit it to one, and usually that's the city we are looking for anyways, so yeah, nice. So all the settings are good to go. Now we can retrieve the API URL here, which we will call in our code. Now let's head over to our code. So first, you'll want to add these imports here. So this will be our program that will take in a city from the user's input and then display the weather conditions of the entered city. First, we surround our program in a try-catch block, where if an exception occurs, it will print out what the error is into console. Then we create a scanner object to read user input. Next, we create a string variable named city, which will store in the entered city from the user. After that, we create a do-while loop where the breaking condition is if the user types in no. But after editing this, I realized we could just have let the condition be true, and you'll see why in a sec. Then we add a few system.outs just for visual purposes so that the user knows what to type in the console. After that, we request for the user to type in a city and store in our city variable. If the user enters no, then the program will terminate. Otherwise, it will continue executing. So first, we will call in the Geolocation API to retrieve the JSON object that contains the latitude and longitude values of the entered city. Then finally, once we have the latitude and longitude values, we can call on the weather API to display the weather conditions of the entered city. Alright, let's check out how we are calling the Geolocation API in the getLocationData method. So in the getLocationData method, our first step is to replace any whitespace characters from the entered city to a plus. And we do this because white spaces are not allowed in links, and the plus symbol is used to represent them. And next, we will store in the API URL that we got earlier from the site, but we do have to alter the link a bit to accept the city as part of the link. The next thing we do is create an HTTP connection to the API URL with the fetch API response. So looking at the fetch API response method, this method will be in charge of performing the API call, where we surround it with a try-catch block. Then create our URL object with our URL string, and then we open that connection and store that into a HTTP URL connection. You can also set the request method if you want, but since we are retrieving data from this API, we set it to GET, and then it just returns that connection. If there was an issue with the connection, then we just return null, indicating that it failed. Then we check to see if the response from the API was successful by checking the response code. If the response code is 200, it means that the connection was successful. Anything else, it means that there was an issue. So if the response code wasn't successful, then we catch it by printing out an error and then returning null, which basically just stops the rest of the code from running. If it was successful though, we will call on the read API response method to read the response from our API call. To read the JSON response, we first create a string builder named result.json, which we will use to store in the incoming JSON data from our API call. Then we read the incoming response using the scanner class and passing the input stream from our HTTP URL connection that we made earlier, where the input stream represents the JSON data from our API call. How it works is that we use a while loop that will iterate through each line from our JSON data and then append that to our result.json string builder. After that, we make sure to close our scanner to free up some resources and then return our JSON data as a string. Also, don't forget to put these lines of code in a try-catch block. Then we also return null, meaning that there was an issue reading the response. Next, we will use the JSON parser class to parse our JSON response string and create a JSON object from it, where we can access the values more easily by using a get method and passing in a key value to get the corresponding JSON value. Note that these classes and other JSON classes that we will be using are from the jar file that we integrated into our project in the beginning of the video. To parse the JSON response string into a JSON object, we call on the parse method, which returns an object type. Since we want this to be of JSON object type, we cast the returned object into a JSON object. To get a visual of what is being returned, let's go back to the Geolocation API site. So this API lets us view the JSON data on our browser by clicking on this link. We can see the latitude and longitude data here, but how do we go about reading this JSON data in our code? So first, whenever you see these angle brackets, that means it is a JSON object, and we need to store them in a JSON object class. Now within this JSON object, we have our data of results and generation time _ms. But for now, we're going to get the results data only, but now we have to ask, what type of data does it store? If you're trying to get the data from a JSON, you have to look after the colon to see what type of data it stores. In this case, results is storing an array of JSON objects because of the square brackets and the nested angle brackets within it. Once we have access to this, we should be able to get the latitude and longitude values with no problem. Alright, let's get back to the code. So remember, we want to get the results array, and to do that, we have to call on the get method from our JSON object. As a side note, every time we are getting something from a JSON, it will always return us an object type, and it is up to us to cast it to the correct type. Remember that results is an array of JSON objects, so we store it as a JSON array. Then we return the first index of the array, as there is only one data in the array due to the settings that we declared earlier. But we also have to cast it as a JSON object because the data is surrounded by angle brackets. And again, don't forget to add a try-catch block around this code. Also, if there was an error retrieving the JSON response, we return null. Next, to retrieve the latitude and longitude data, we do the same thing, but we pass in the key values, which are the latitude and longitude, to retrieve the data. And the type that is stored in the JSON data for these will be a double type. And I'll also show you guys what the other data's type would be if you wanted to use them. Now we have successfully retrieved the latitude and longitude values for our entered city, which we'll need to get the weather API to work. Next up, we will be working with the weather API. First, we'll go to this site here, which I'll leave a link down in the description. And again, I'm not going to go over too much of the API for this video, but for the settings, I'm just going to retrieve the current temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed. Next, we will retrieve the API link, which will vary according to the settings that you've chosen. So we can also view the JSON response by using our API link in our browser or clicking on this link here. Here we can see the JSON response of our API call, and the data that we are interested can be found here. So the plan is to get this JSON object, then get the current JSON object, and once we have the current JSON object, we can access the temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed JSON data. Alright, let's head back to the code. So we will call on our weather API in the display weather data method, where we pass in the longitude and latitude values that we got with the geolocation API. In the display weather data method, we store in the API URL that we got from the site and also adjust it so that it accepts our latitude and longitude values. Then we perform the API call using the fetch API response method, similar to how we did it when we called the geolocation API. Also, we check if the response code is 200, which again means it was successful, otherwise output an error and stop the rest of the code from executing. If the API call was successful, we then read the response and store it into a string named JSON response. Now we are going to create our JSON parser, which we will use to convert our JSON response string into a JSON object. So when we parse our JSON response string, we are storing this into a JSON object. Next, we will want the current JSON object, so we use the get method and pass in the key value of current. Since we know that the get method returns an object type, we have to cast it to a JSON object. Now that we have the current JSON object, it's time to output our temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed. And to get these values, we will be using the get method as well, while passing in their corresponding key values. And also remember, since it returns an object, we also have to cast them to their corresponding types. For temperature and wind speed, they will be of double type, and then relative humidity will be of long type. And if you're curious on what the other data's type would be, these would be the corresponding data types. Now let's test our program. So from this example, you should have a better understanding on how to perform API calls in Java. As a bonus, I'll leave a link in the description of public APIs that you can use for your upcoming projects. Leave a like if this helped and subscribe, as it really helps motivate me to continue making more content. Also, I have a tutorial on my channel where I built a GUI using the same API I used in this video to display the weather data after inputting a city from the GUI. You can see that GUI in the left side of this video now, and if you're interested, you can click on the video that's on the right to get started on the project. I guarantee you'll learn something new.